You've probably seen a number display like this before. Specifically, I'm talking about the 7-segment display. This is the greatest of all segmented display designs. It effectively represents the numbers 0 through 9, as well as most letters, making it useful for things like microwaves and DVD player displays and, of course, pocket calculators. Now, in the modern age, high-resolution displays have become so cheap that we don't often see these kinds of displays anymore. But I think just about everyone can appreciate their elegance. Although it's by far the most common, the 7-segment design is certainly not the only kind of segmented display out there. The YouTuber Posey made a lovely video on a variety of designs, including quite a few of his own. And in that video he stated,
"Displaying the 10 digits with less than 6 segments is near impossible. It can be done, but the readability suffers greatly, so it cannot really be done."
So today I'm going to talk about the mostly academic and pointless exercise of trying to create segmented display designs with as few segments as possible. I'm going to look at a number of designs that people have posted online, and I'm going to share a couple of my own too. Now, I started out talking about 7-segment displays, and getting even from that to just 6 is a real design challenge. The fewer segments you have, the harder it gets to reasonably represent the Arabic numerals. The hard limit is 4 segments, because when you have 3 segments, you only have 2 to the third power, or 8 possible combinations, which isn't enough to represent the 10 digits 0 through 9. And those 8 possibilities including having all the segments off, which hardly counts. But in practice, even 4 segments might be impossible to do decently, as we'll see later, at least if we're following some rules which I'm going to lay out now. These rules are: you can't have disconnected segments that are counted as the same segment. You can't have segments pass under other segments. And you can't use arbitrarily thin segments to try to pretend that 2 distinct segments are actually one segment. This is basically just cheating to get around the first 2 rules. There actually were some kinds of number displays that could break some of these rules in practice, but you typically don't see it with LCDs. And just for the purpose of this as a kind of challenge, I'm going to follow these rules. I'm not passing judgment on people that don't follow these rules for their own designs, but these are my rules. Let's start out with 6-segment displays. I don't actually have a 6-segment design of my own, but I think this is a good place to start to kind of get an idea of the challenge that we're up against. Perhaps surprisingly, there is a Segment Displays Wiki fandom, but on this page for 6-segment designs, they don't have any pictures, just text descriptions. So I'm going to look at some designs that I found elsewhere, like Reddit or YouTube. So let's start out by looking at Posey's video again. He has a couple of 6-segment designs, which he calls X and Freeform. As you would expect, these designs are very aesthetically pleasing. When you get below 7 segments, you inevitably have to make compromises, so I'm going to try to talk about those with each design that I show. But like I said, these compromises are inherent to using this few segments. It's impossible not to compromise. So this isn't really criticism, it's just discussion of what had to be done to make these designs possible. So in these 2 Posey designs, I think the main compromise is the 4. It looks a bit more like a backwards Y than a 4. There's also a small 0, which is a common compromise, and it's one I settled for in my own 2 designs that I'm showing today. There are actually 2 very small subreddits, both dedicated to segmented displays. Here's a post by user Creeper Schmeeper, and I really like this design. It has this sort of slanted aesthetic that reminds me of lightning for some reason. And they actually posted an interactive version where you can turn the segments on and off, which is pretty cool. Here's a very different design. It's more calculator-like, more boxy, and I also really like it. Here's a take that is basically a riff on the calculator-style 7-segment design. It joins together the bottom and bottom left segments and adjusts the gaps and angles a bit. It works pretty well. Here's an interesting design. They have a large, not small, but pointed 0. All of the digits are pretty well represented here, and I like it. The YouTuber Yenji Jum did a video on 6, 5, and 4 segment displays. Actually, a lot like I'm doing right now. So I'm, copying him. But anyway, they showed off a number of designs, and this one violates the no crossing under segments rule, but that doesn't mean we can't look at it. The kind of unique compromise here is the small 7. Here's another, and this one is pretty cool. It's very boxy, and it does a great job of representing all of the numbers. The 7 is kind of a bit compromised, and you also have a small 0, which again is very common. I'm going to stop there for 6 segment designs, and like I said, I don't have a design of my own to show for this, but I think it's useful to look at because you can see that even with 6 segments we're already running into limitations. But now let's look at 5 segment displays. Here's one posted on Reddit, and, well, to be honest, I have a lot of difficulty reading this, but I do appreciate it. Here's another post, and here we're actually getting a sneak peek of a 4 segment design, although this one actually just straight up doesn't have the number 4. Looking at the 5 segment display, which is on the bottom, it looks nice. I like it. It has this very bubbly aesthetic, which gives it a lot of appeal. Here's another design by a Redditor that we saw earlier. And to nitpick, I guess the main compromises here are the 7, which has that middle segment, as well as maybe the 1 a little bit, and you do have a small 0. But this design is pretty great. Here's 2 designs that I think are interesting. The main compromises are the 7, which is minuscule on the bottom design and only a bit larger on the top design. And I guess the 3 is kind of compromised a bit as well. But again, I'm not trying to pass judgment here. You have to make compromises with this few segments. Here's a pretty out there design, and I think it's pretty readable, except the 4 and the 9. But it's a cool aesthetic. It feels almost alien. And finally, we'll return to Yenji Jim with 2 other 5 segment designs. This one is pretty hard for me to read, honestly, but the segment design reminds me of insects. And the second 5 segment display design is pretty great. It's very readable, and it represents all of the numbers pretty well. And I guess the only compromises are the small 0 and maybe the 2 and the 6. Now, I've experimented with segmented display designs a lot, and last year I created a 5 segment design that I really liked, so here it is. I think it does a good job of representing the numbers with fairly little compromise. But while I am attached to this design, it's not hard to see the flaws, and it's only fair if I point them out. I think the main one is the disconnected 2, but also the 4 has this foot, which is unusual, and of course there is a small 0. Still, I really like this design, and I honestly think it's one of my personal 2 favorite 5 segment designs. And I say 2 because after I made this design, I found a similar, though distinct, design posted on Reddit. That post didn't receive much attention, but here it is. The designs are quite similar. The main differences are the 2 in this one is more connected, but the 3 has a shorter middle segment. The 4 no longer has a foot, but the 5 has much less of an overhang. I think I just slightly still prefer my own design, but I am really biased. What do you think? As I said earlier, I don't think you can do a fully representative number display with only 4 segments, but you can get close. Let's look at some online examples. And I should warn you that the path of designing 4 segment displays is one that inevitably leads to madness. Here's a design that comes from a Redditor that we've already seen twice now. And I think this design is really clever. It's extremely readable, especially for only 4 segments. This design is rather more esoteric. I guess it's really more like 3 designs, all based on a common theme. The last design gets pretty close to representing all of the Arabic numerals accurately. Here's a design from a YouTube channel called Lux Funded Scientific Institute. It utilizes distinct segments, so it violates our personal rules, but it does do a great job of representing all of the numbers. This design's pretty neat. because it's meant to look like neon signs, and it also does a great job of representing the numbers. And I realize that saying that may not sound like high praise, but it actually is when it comes to 4 segments. With this few segments, most of your designs will come out looking like complete nonsense. So really, these are all great. Here's another design where we see the return of the pointed 0, which is always fun to see. Here's a design that utilizes separate segments. And this is a good example of how when you reduce the number of segments, the design of each segment tends to get more and more complex, because each segment essentially has to do more work. And that really is part of the genius of the standard 7-segment design, which can get away with basically 7 rectangles. Here's another neat design. Here the 4 is not really a 4, but I really like the overall style. This design I also appreciate for its elegant simplicity. This design goes a little bit out there with the complexity, but in doing so, it enables individual segments to represent entire numbers. This design is pretty nifty. It's elegant, and it does a good job of representing all of the digits. It also has a minus sign available for negative numbers, which was also present in at least one of the earlier designs. Here's a Y design, and this one is much less elegant, but in return you do get really good representation of all the numbers with fairly little compromise. And returning one last time to Yenji Gem, here's a design. And here's another. And as Yenji Gem points out, with this one, the 4 and the 9 are the same, but I do like it. And finally, there's this design, which does dip more into complexity, but you do get pretty good representation of all the numbers. Now, I've spent more time than is probably reasonable experimenting with 4-segment designs, and honestly, most of them are
pure garbage.
Just absolute trash. And honestly, I don't think even my final result is one of my favorite 4-segment displays. I think that would be one of the designs I've shown earlier. But still, I don't think it's bad at all. So, here it is. Compared to my 5-segment design, the segments are definitely increased in complexity. I think the main compromises here are the pointed 0, which isn't really quite closed, the disconnected 2, and I guess the 5 is also kind of a little bit too much like a 6. But still, I think you could pick up reading this with very little effort. Anyway, I'm going to leave the topic there for now. My designs are free to use, and I think the 4-segment design could be good in a kind of retro-future aesthetic, because it looks kind of alien and strange at first glance, but it's simplistic and fairly readable. If you liked this video and you'd like to see more segmented displays in the future, too bad. Just kidding. I do have a few other display designs tucked away in my art files, but if I do return to them, it'll be a while. Still, stick around on this channel because I have a number of other, mostly unrelated things on the way. And thank you for watching.